In the harsh winter of 1887, in the wild Wyoming Territory, a man was about to lose everything. Until one unwanted woman did what no cowboy could. This is a story of pride, patience, and a love nobody saw coming. The church bell finished its final toll and fell quiet, leaving the cold air ringing in its absence. Frost clung to the edges of the stone steps like delicate lace, and the congregation spilled out slowly, boots scraping against the frozen ground, breaths visible in soft white clouds. Voices stayed low with the restraint of Sunday morning. Margaret Hale descended last, as she always did. Over the years, she had learned to let others go ahead, young couples walking close with shared secrets, mothers tugging at restless children bundled in wool, men pausing to talk of cattle prices and the threat of heavier snows. There was no hurry for her. No one waited at her side. No arm offered to steady her on the icy steps. Halfway down, she heard her name, not spoken to her face but shaped around it like a familiar garment. "She's still teaching," one woman said softly. 17 years now and never married." Another replied with a sigh that carried just far enough. "Not even once." Margaret kept her eyes forward, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. Near the rail, a ranch hand leaned with careless ease, his hat tipped back, his grin loose and familiar. He glanced her way as she passed and said loud enough for several to hear, "That woman will die married to her books." A ripple of laughter followed, not cruel enough to stop the flow of people, but sharp enough to sting like a switch on bare skin. Margaret did not pause. Her boots touched the dirt road. Her back remained straight. Years of practice held her posture firm even as something tightened behind her ribs. She had long ago learned the unwritten rules of this wind-bitten corner of the Wyoming Territory. A woman was measured first by youth, second by beauty, and only third by usefulness, and usefulness earned only tolerance, never tenderness. She passed the hitching post where horses stamped against the cold, the general store with its frosted windows, and the last cluster of women still murmuring. At the edge of the churchyard she adjusted her scarf, fingers steady. In the church window her reflection met her briefly, hairpin plain, dress mended cleanly at the cuffs, eyes calm and watchful. Nothing dramatic. Nothing fragile. Inside, a quiet longing lived like a breath held for so long it had become habit. As she stepped onto the road, a sudden shout cracked the air, sharp and startled, followed by the thunder of hooves and the crash of splintering wood from the corral down the way. Heads turned. Laughter died. Margaret did not look back, but the sound followed her, echoing deeper than any whispered joke. Before the day was done, the town that had laughed at her would begin, uneasily, to notice her. The stallion belonged to Luke Bennett, though no one would have guessed the depth of his attachment by watching the chaos in the corral. The horse circled like a storm trapped in flesh and bone, black coat slick with sweat, powerful muscles coiled tight, eyes bright with panic and fury. Two men already stood nearby brushing dust from their coats, pride bruised but bones spared by luck alone. Luke climbed into the saddle anyway. He was younger than most men who owned land outright in these parts, lean and sharp-edged from honest work rather than hardship. His ranch sat on good ground, close enough to water, far enough from town to promise a measure of independence. Now that independence hung by a thread. A cattle investor from Cheyenne stood near the rail, hands clasped behind his back, watching with cool appraisal. The man's coat was too fine for the territory, his boots still polished. "This horse decides the deal," he had said earlier, voice flat. "If you can't manage your own stock, I won't put my money into your land." Luke had swung up cleanly. For half a second balance held. Then the stallion exploded. It reared so violently the fence rattled. Someone shouted. Someone else laughed. The horse twisted with savage precision, and Luke was flung sideways. His body struck the ground with a heavy, breath-stealing thud. The world stilled for a moment. Luke lay flat on his back staring at the pale winter sky, chest burning. The investor took a step back, unimpressed. "That horse can't be controlled," he said evenly. "And without control, your land isn't worth my price." Luke forced himself upright, teeth clenched against the flare of pain along his ribs. He said nothing. Words would not change the truth standing in front of him. At the far fence line, Margaret Hale had stopped. She had been returning from the schoolhouse, slate dust still faint on her sleeves. She stood unnoticed among taller, louder men. Her gaze fixed not on Luke but on the horse. Where others saw danger, she saw terror, deep, animal terror. She remembered her father's hands, steady on a trembling neck many years ago. She remembered his low, patient voice teaching her that force only sharpened fear, that a horse fought hardest when it believed it was about to lose everything it had ever known. The stallion screamed again, high and raw. Without thinking, Margaret took a single step closer. The horse stilled, just for a breath. Its head lowered a fraction. Its breathing slowed. Then someone spoke, the moment shattered, and the horse lunged again. Chaos returned in full force. Margaret stepped back, heart pounding not from fright but from recognition. She knew what that horse needed. And she knew just as surely that the town would not thank her for knowing it. By the next afternoon the town had folded yesterday's spectacle into its daily conversation the way it folded everything, quickly, with embellishments. Men leaned against fences longer than necessary. Boys loitered near the corrals hoping for another show. The stallion had earned a reputation overnight, and reputations, like rumors, grew quickly in small places. Margaret Hale passed the corrals on her walk home from school, steps unhurried, books tucked beneath her arm. The children's voices still echoed faintly in her ears, the steady rhythm of lessons and recitation a comfort she had earned through patience and quiet authority. Cal Hargreaves saw her coming. He lounged against the fence with practiced ease, hat pulled low, coat clean in a way that spoke of money rather than honest sweat. His land bordered Luke Bennett's, and he never missed a chance to remind anyone of the difference. "Schoolmarms ought to mind chalk," Cal said, voice carrying easily. "Not horses." A few men nearby laughed. Not hard. Not kindly. The kind of laughter that assumed agreement. Margaret stopped. The pause itself unsettled them. She turned and looked at Cal not sharply, not timidly, but with the calm attention she gave a student who had spoken out of turn. "I do mind chalk," she said evenly. "And children and my own affairs." Cal grinned wider. "Didn't mean offense. Just saying some things ain't meant for everyone." Margaret held his gaze another moment. "That's true," she replied. "Some things aren't." She turned and walked on. Behind her the laughter resumed, thinner this time. Luke Bennett stood a short distance away, one arm stiff against his side, ribs still aching. He had heard every word. He saw Margaret pause. He saw her answer. And he said nothing. Margaret felt the silence more keenly than the insult. She reached the edge of the corral yard when the stallion screamed again, high, frantic, raw. Men shouted. Someone cursed. The horse slammed against the rail, desperate and wild. Margaret slowed. Every instinct urged her to turn back. She didn't. Not yet. Because she understood something the others did not. Stepping forward now would not save her dignity. It would only invite another kind of cruelty. and dignity, once surrendered, was never returned freely. That night, long after the supper lamps were extinguished and the town had settled into uneasy quiet, Margaret returned. The sky lay clear and cold, stars sharp enough to wound. The corral stood half in shadow, half in moonlight. The stallion's dark shape moved restlessly within it. Luke sat nearby on an overturned bucket, coat pulled tight, breathing shallow with pain and worry. He had not heard her approach. The stallion did. Its pacing slowed. Hooves stilled. Its breathing changed, less frantic, more wary, as if it sensed something unfamiliar and worth noticing. Margaret stopped just outside the fence. She did not speak at first. She stood with hands resting lightly on the rail, posture loose and unthreatening. When she finally spoke, her voice was low enough that Luke almost missed it. "It's all right," she murmured. "No one's here to take anything from you." The stallion lifted its head. Margaret continued, voice steady. The words themselves mattered less than their tone. She spoke the way her father once had, not to command, not to challenge, but to share space, to acknowledge fear without feeding it. The horse took a step closer. Luke's breath caught. He did not move. He barely dared to breathe. Margaret moved along the fence, slow as dawn creeping over the hills. The stallion followed. Muscles still tight but no longer striking out. Ears flicked forward. Breathing eased. For one fragile moment the corral held something like peace. Then a board creaked beneath Luke's boot. The stallion startled, rearing back, panic surging again. Margaret stepped away at once. She did not look toward Luke. She did not wait for thanks or questions. She turned and walked into the dark, her figure swallowed by shadow and distance. Luke remained frozen, heart pounding, staring at the space she had occupied. The stallion circled once, then stopped, confused and quieter than before. Luke understood then that what he had witnessed was not luck. It was skill. And the knowledge settled heavy in his chest, bringing with it a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The next morning Luke waited until the sun had risen a little higher. He told himself it was courtesy, that daylight would make the conversation easier. The truth was simpler. Asking for real help required humility he had not practiced often. Margaret Hale stood outside the schoolhouse locking the door after lessons when he approached. The late autumn sun sat low, casting long shadows across the yard. Children's footprints marked the dirt, already beginning to fade. "I saw you last night," Luke said. Margaret did not look surprised. She turned the key once more, ensuring the lock had caught, then faced him fully. "Then you know why I won't help," she replied. Luke shifted his weight. Pain flashed briefly across his face before he smoothed it away. "I didn't laugh," he said quietly. "No," Margaret answered. "You stayed quiet." The words were not sharp. They were simply true. Luke met her eyes and held them. "I should have spoken." "Yes," she said. "You should have." Silence stretched between them, not awkward but measured. Margaret had spent years teaching children the value of pauses. She allowed one now. "I'm asking," Luke said at last plainly. "Will you help me?" Margaret folded her hands. The leather of her gloves creased softly. "I won't be laughed at twice," she said. "Not by men who think silence costs nothing." Luke nodded. He did not argue. He did not offer payment or promise protection. He accepted the refusal as it stood. "That's fair," he said. He turned and walked away, shoulders squared, leaving behind more than pride. He left behind necessity. Margaret watched him go, expression composed. Only when he was out of sight did she exhale. Refusal was its own kind of courage, and like all courage it carried a price she would feel later. The town did not allow refusals to remain private. By midweek the story had bent itself out of shape. Whispers slipped between counters and across fence rails. "She's chasing him," someone said. "Desperate at her age," another added. "Think she's special because a horse didn't buck," came the laugh. Margaret endured it in silence. She had endured worse, but endurance did not mean immunity. At the mercantile, as she waited her turn, a younger woman, pretty, bright-eyed, newly married, laughed openly with her friends. "Imagine," the woman said, glancing pointedly at Margaret, "thinking a man like that would notice you." The words landed clean and sharp. Margaret finished her purchase. She did not hurry. She did not respond. But that night she did not sleep. Before dawn she pulled on her coat and walked toward the corrals. The sky was just beginning to pale. Luke was already there, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Surprise crossed his face as he saw her approach. "I'll help the horse," Margaret said. Luke straightened. "You said—" "I said I wouldn't be laughed at," she interrupted. "Not that I would let cruelty decide what I do." She met his gaze steadily. "Only the horse. Early mornings. No witnesses. No stories." Luke nodded at once. "Whatever you say." She added one more condition, quieter. "This does not mean I am wanted." Luke hesitated. Then he said honestly, "It means you're needed." Margaret accepted the distinction. As the stallion lifted its head, sensing her presence once more, she stepped forward, not as a woman seeking approval but as one setting the terms under which she would stand. Because dignity, when held firmly enough, could still shape the world around it. They began before sunrise. The air was always cold enough to sting, breath lifting pale between them. Margaret approached the corral with measured steps. Luke learned quickly not to rush toward her, not to speak too loudly, not to carry his frustration into the space she was trying to calm. The stallion learned faster. Margaret never touched him at first. She stood just close enough for him to feel her presence, posture loose, shoulders angled away. She spoke steadily, never repeating herself, never raising her voice. Luke watched and listened. He learned when to move and when to stop. He learned that force invited resistance, and that patience, real patience, cost more than strength. There were mornings when the horse refused entirely, turning his flank and snorting, daring them to try. Margaret never punished him. "Fear isn't stubbornness," she said once quietly. "It's memory." Luke absorbed the words without comment. Days passed, then weeks. The town noticed the change before the investor did. The stallion's pacing slowed. His eyes softened. He stood still long enough for Luke to brush his neck, then longer still. Once he even accepted the saddle without a fight. Luke felt pride rising, but it was tempered now, shaped by gratitude he did not yet know how to name. He did not flirt. He did not test boundaries. He treated Margaret with a careful respect that surprised them both. When he spoke it was to ask questions. When he thanked her it was without flourish. Margaret appreciated that. Still, she kept her distance. She did not linger. She did not stay for coffee or conversation. She returned home each morning with cold hands and a guarded heart. Respect, she knew, was not affection. Usefulness, no matter how valued, was not the same as being chosen. One morning as the stallion stood calm between them, Luke glanced at her with something close to wonder. Margaret saw it, and turned away. Because wonder, like kindness, could mislead a woman who had lived too long without either. The cattle investor returned on a gray afternoon. His boots were clean, his expression firm. "You've made progress," he said, watching the stallion stand quietly at the rail. "But progress isn't certainty." Luke said nothing. The investor continued, voice low but pointed. "There's talk about you and the school teacher. That kind of arrangement raises questions." Margaret stood a short distance away, hands folded, eyes fixed on the horse. "I don't invest where things look unsettled," the investor added. "Make it proper or I walk." That night Luke came to Margaret's small house. He stood straight, hat in hand, words rehearsed and stripped of anything resembling romance. "I can't lose the ranch," he said. "A marriage would settle things. Protect us both." Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she waited a moment longer, long enough for the truth to settle fully in her chest. "You're asking for a solution," she said calmly. "Not a wife." Luke swallowed. "I'm asking for fairness." She shook her head slowly. "No. You're asking me to disappear into usefulness." Luke stepped closer. "It wouldn't be unkind." Margaret met his eyes. Something wounded but unbroken shone through. "I won't be traded like land," she said. "Not now. Not ever." The words were quiet. Final. Luke stepped back as if struck. Margaret opened the door. "Good night, Mr. Bennett." She closed it gently behind her. Inside she stood very still, hands pressed flat against the wood, breathing through the ache that refusal always carried. Outside, Luke remained on the step longer than he should have. Both of them understood with sudden clarity that necessity alone could never build a life worth standing in. The deal began to collapse quietly. The investor stopped coming in person. Letters arrived instead, polite, careful, increasingly distant. Luke read them at night by lamplight, ribs still aching, the future narrowing with each measured sentence. By week's end he began preparing to unwind the deal. Not in anger. In acceptance. Margaret heard the news as these things were always heard in town, second-hand, stripped of mercy. Voices carried a certainty that order was being restored. That evening she walked to Luke's ranch. He was mending tack when she entered the yard. He looked up at once. Surprise flickered across his face before resignation took its place. "You don't owe me anything," he said quickly. "I won't ask again." "I know," Margaret replied. She stood with hands folded, posture straight, breath steady. There was no rush in her voice now, no defense. "I won't marry to save you," she said. "I won't marry because I'm useful or because the town finds it easier to respect a married woman." Luke listened unmoving. "But I will marry you," she continued, "as a partner." The words settled between them, deliberate, unromantic, solid. "My work remains mine. My voice carries weight. And whatever affection comes must come honestly." Luke held her gaze. "I can promise that," he said. For the first time there was no need in his voice. Only resolve. They were married 2 days later. No crowd gathered. No music played. The minister spoke plainly. 2 witnesses stood close enough to hear the words but not close enough to intrude. Margaret and Luke faced each other, hands joined lightly as if testing the shape of something newly real. When the minister nodded and stepped back there was a brief uncertain pause. Luke looked to Margaret, not for permission but for understanding. She inclined her head once. He leaned in and kissed her. It was brief, careful, a single gentle meeting of lips. More promise than passion. More respect than claim. When he drew back, Margaret's breath caught, surprised not by the act but by the steadiness of it. That night they took separate rooms. The kiss had not sealed love, but it had sealed intent. And that, for Margaret Hale, was something she had waited a lifetime to be offered freely. The storm came without warning. Wind tore down from the hills at dusk, carrying sleet that stung the skin and rattled shutters. The horses grew restless long before the first thunder cracked, hoofs striking the ground sharp and anxious. The stallion screamed. Luke ran for the corral, coat half buttoned, rain already soaking through. Lightning split the sky as he reached the gate. The stallion lunged against the rail, panic surging, eyes white with terror. "Easy!" Luke shouted, but the wind swallowed his voice. The gate gave way. The stallion bolted, smashing through the weakened fence. Chaos spilled into the yard. Other horses panicked in response. The night filled with noise, motion, and danger. Luke moved too fast. A shoulder struck him hard, sending him sprawling into the mud. Pain flared bright and blinding. He tried to rise and failed. Margaret appeared through the storm like a fixed point. She did not shout. She did not hesitate. She stepped into the churned ground, skirt soaked, hair plastered loose by rain. She raised her voice, not loud but steady, cutting through the frenzy with practiced authority. "Stand!" she called. "Stand and listen!" The stallion faltered. Margaret advanced, boots sinking, heart hammering but hands steady. She spoke again, words low and unbroken, her voice anchoring what the world had torn loose. The stallion slowed, trembled, then stopped. Luke watched from the ground, rain blurring his vision, as Margaret took the halter and held firm. When the storm finally passed, the corral stood broken but still standing. Luke lay shaken but alive. Margaret stood soaked and breathing hard, having done what strength alone never could. She had saved the horse. She had saved the man. And she had done it without asking permission. Morning came pale and quiet, as if the land itself were recovering. The storm had left broken boards, churned mud, and a corral that leaned but still stood. Word traveled quickly. Men gathered by mid-morning, some to help mend, some to stare, some simply because they had heard something had happened and wanted to see the proof. Luke stood near the rail, ribs bound, arms stiff, hat pulled low. Margaret remained a few steps back, hands folded, dress still marked by dried mud she had not bothered to scrub away. The stallion stood calm. That fact alone unsettled the crowd. "Well," one man said, clapping Luke on the shoulder, "looks like you finally mastered him." Luke lifted his head. "No," he said. The word cut cleanly through the murmurs. "He didn't master himself. And I didn't master him." The men shifted, uncertain. Luke turned slightly, angling his body so there was no mistaking who stood beside him. "She did." All eyes moved to Margaret. She did not step forward. She did not lower her gaze. "She saved the horse," Luke said, "and she saved me. Some of you would have lost more than fence boards last night. Horses would have bolted and it wouldn't have stopped there." Silence settled heavy and awkward. Cal Hargreaves stood near the back, arms crossed, usual smirk nowhere to be found. He said nothing. Then from the edge of the group a small voice spoke up. A boy, one of Margaret's students, stood with his cap clutched in both hands. "She's the bravest one here," he said simply. The words landed without flourish, without argument. And something shifted. Men removed their hats. A few murmured apologies, not loud, not theatrical, but sincere in their discomfort. Heads bowed. Eyes dropped. Margaret felt the weight of it, Not triumph, not vindication, but release. For the first time in years her worth was not whispered about. It was spoken. That evening Luke found Margaret at the corral. The light was soft. The air clean. The land settling back into its ordinary rhythms. The stallion stood between them, head lowered, calm as a lake after wind. "I turned down another investment offer today," Luke said. Margaret looked up. "Why?" "It would have kept the money coming," he answered, "but it came with conditions. Oversight. Other men deciding how this ranch was run and who had a place on it." Margaret studied him carefully. "You didn't owe me that." "I know," Luke said. "That's why it mattered." He took a breath. "I didn't marry you because I needed a solution. I married you because I saw who you were. And I didn't want to stand silent again." The words were not grand. They were steady. Chosen. Margaret felt something in her chest ease at last, not hope rising but certainty settling. They stood together, not touching, not distant. From the yard beyond, children's voices carried across the dusk. "Mrs. Bennet!" one called. Margaret turned at the sound. The name no longer felt borrowed. No longer provisional. She smiled, not the polite smile she had practiced for years, but a real one. The stallion shifted closer, resting easy between them. And for the first time Margaret Hale believed what the world had finally learned to say aloud, that a woman could be overlooked for years and still be chosen openly when the moment came. The days that followed carried the quiet weight of new beginnings. Winter deepened across the Wyoming Territory, bringing snow that blanketed the hills and turned the world into soft, muffled shapes. Luke and Margaret moved through their shared life with careful intention. Morning still found them at the corral sometimes, though the stallion no longer needed the same gentle coaxing. He had grown steady under Margaret's influence, responding to her voice with a trust that spoke volumes. Luke watched these interactions with a growing appreciation that went beyond gratitude. He saw the patience in her hands, the wisdom in her quiet observations about the land and the animals that lived upon it. In the evenings they sat by the fire in the ranch house, separate at first in their habits, but slowly drawing closer in conversation. Margaret spoke of her year's teaching, the children who struggled with letters and those who found joy in them, the way the prairie wind could make a classroom feel both isolated and alive with possibility. Luke shared stories of building the ranch, of the dreams he had carried since he was young, of the mistakes he had made and the lessons hard-won from the unforgiving land. There were no grand declarations of love in those early weeks, only the steady building of understanding, like stones carefully placed to form a strong foundation. The town, too, adjusted in its own uneven way. Whispers did not vanish overnight, but they changed tone. Women who had once passed Margaret with averted eyes now offered cautious greetings. Men who had laughed at the idea of her with horses nodded with respect when they saw her riding beside Luke, back straight, gaze steady. Cal Hargreave kept his distance, his silence a small victory in itself. The schoolchildren, especially, carried a new pride in their teacher. They recited lessons with extra care, as if her bravery had somehow become part of their own story. One clear afternoon, as the sun broke through thinning clouds and cast long golden light across the snow, Luke and Margaret rode out together to check the fences. The stallion moved easily beneath Luke, while Margaret rode a steadier mare she had chosen for its calm temperament. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. They spoke little at first, content with the rhythm of hooves and the vast quiet of the territory. "You know," Luke said eventually, breaking the silence, "I used to think control was everything. Breaking the horse. Securing the deal. Proving I could stand alone. He glanced over at her. I was wrong about a lot of things. Margaret kept her eyes on the horizon. We all learn as we go. The land doesn't forgive easily, but it does teach if we listen. Luke nodded. I'm listening now. He paused, then added softly, to more than just the land. She turned to him then, and in her eyes he saw the same careful hope he felt growing in his own chest. Not the whirlwind passion of youth, but something deeper, earned, chosen, and therefore stronger for the waiting. They continued their ride, side by side, partners in the truest sense, as the winter light wrapped around them like a promise of spring yet to come. Through the months that followed, their life together wove threads of routine and discovery. Margaret continued teaching, her classroom a place of warmth and order amid the harshness of the territory. Luke worked the ranch with renewed purpose, his decisions now informed by her insights into the animals and the subtle signs of weather. They shared meals at the sturdy wooden table, conversations stretching longer as trust deepened. Small kindnesses accumulated, Luke leaving extra wood by the stove on colder nights, Margaret mending his shirts with stitches so fine they seemed invisible. The stallion became a symbol between them, not of the chaos that had once threatened everything, but of the calm that patience and understanding could bring. In time, affection grew not as a sudden flame but as a steady glow, warming the spaces between them. Luke found himself watching for her return from school each day, a quiet anticipation he no longer tried to hide. Margaret allowed herself to smile more freely, the guarded heart she had carried for so long opening like the prairie flowers after the snowmelt. They had chosen each other not out of desperation or convenience alone, but because they had seen the worth beneath the surface, the strength in quiet resolve, the value in a partnership built on respect. The story of the woman no man had wanted and the cowboy who saw her worth spread beyond their small ranch town in quiet ways. Travelers carried tales of the schoolteacher who calmed the wildest horse and stood firm in the storm. But for Luke and Margaret, the truest measure was not in stories told to strangers. It was in the shared glances across the corral, the steady presence beside each other through seasons of hardship and plenty, and the knowledge that they had built something lasting, not despite the judgments of others, but in quiet defiance of them. In the winter of 1887 and the years that followed, they proved that dignity, patience, and honest choice could tame more than any wild stallion. They could build a life worth riding into the future together.